From the Alvin and Rosalie Sarachek studio, PBS Kansas presents Kansas Week.
Today on Kansas Week, a call to finally end the school funding lawsuit against the state. Has the point been made? Plus, despite cries for help from schools across Kansas, one lawmaker says no study of special education funding will happen before the next legislative session. But first, the vacancies in Kansas classrooms are growing. You might be surprised by which teachers are disappearing the fastest now. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. I'm Pilar Pedraza, and this is Kansas Week, a mostly education-oriented Kansas Week to be precise. Several new details coming out this week about Kansas schools. We begin with the Kansas Department of Education's report on teacher vacancies, higher than ever. KAKE's Nick Nelson shows us what that means in Kansas classrooms.
Aaron Miller teaches high school English. He feels strongly that more elementary teachers are needed for students in the state to be successful.
You know, as a secondary teacher, we really notice how much our elementary teachers prepare those students for the upper grades. And so just within my own career, you notice students with maybe less social skills, less ability to function within a classroom. And so elementary is such a foundational time.
And yet in the state of Kansas, elementary teachers are leaving the field. And the Kansas State Board of Education has seen the problem. Board members call the number of vacancies at the elementary level alarming, growing from 329 last fall to where we are now.
The elementary up to 462, and this is the first time since we've gathered this data that an area has outpaced special education in vacancies. So elementary would technically be our number one vacancy shortage at this moment.
Educators in the area worry about what these shortages might mean for Kansas education as a whole. Miller, who was inspired by his mother to be a teacher, says Kansas is in a critical time right now when it comes to education and believes the state should be rethinking how teachers are supported.
Do I have the materials to teach my students effectively? And unfortunately for many teachers, the answer is no. And they're creating their own materials, they're buying their own materials, they're going out of their way to find materials, which is a lot of work. And so I think that having access to quality curriculum and a budget to purchase that curriculum is number one.
In Valley Center, Nick Nelson, KAKE News on your side.
And joining us this week, we've got former Republican State Senator Phil Journey and Suzanne Perez with the KMUW. You've changed jobs and names on me since last time.
That's
well,
right.
Not quite the last time, but close to the last time I had you on the show. Got to make sure I've got that right. And former State Representative Tim Hodge. We've got both our Democrat and our Republican this week. We've struggled with that lately, so we're happy about this. As we look at this issue, though, I mean, when we're talking about teacher vacancies, this is really probably, as a parent, the most important thing, because if this is an unfilled position, that means it's perhaps somebody who's not qualified in that classroom.
That's right. You know, I mean, the word vacancy doesn't just mean, you know, there's a class that doesn't have someone there. It's someone that doesn't have the right license to teach that particular subject area. But what was really interesting from this last data is what you mentioned, the elementary school positions being that, you know, in that short a supply. For decades now, we've been talking about special education, math and science, right? I mean, it's just been every year. And for elementary to jump like that, you know, I just have to think it has to be COVID related, all of the different struggles that teachers are dealing with these days, some of the ones mentioned in your story.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of parents say COVID kids, COVID babies, they're a breed apart, and perhaps that playing a role in it?
Right. I mean, a lot of teachers are talking about behavior issues being so much more of a challenge this year. That has been talked about since they came back from COVID, and now we're 3 years out, and teachers are still saying that behavior is a problem. But then there's all this other, buying your own supplies, and just I hear from the teachers unions, workload. They can negotiate a contract, but at the end of the day, the teachers are working well beyond that contract, and especially elementary teachers. We're in parent-teacher conference time now in Wichita. They're staying till 9 and 10 at night. It's not an easy job.
No, it isn't.
I think probably one of the biggest problems too is that the number of teachers that are exiting the profession. And they need to figure out why that's happening and what they can do to stem that outflow, because it's not going to be able to be maintained if we just have to bet on new teachers coming out of the colleges and getting started. The greatest asset for an organization like a school district is the training that they have put into those existing teachers, and when they lose that teacher, they lose all that training and that investment too, and that's really tragic.
And what I see, to piggyback on that, these folks are some of the most talented people in our state. They can organize thoughts, they can present it to a group of people who don't want to listen to them, they can assess them, and we don't pay them enough. And
Are you sure you're talking about teachers and not journalists?
I'm talking probably both, because you guys have a great responsibility too. But education is enshrined in our Constitution. It's what we have to have, a fair and equitable education system, and that's what makes our state. And that's the job of our legislature and our local school boards to make sure that happens. But you're going to get what you pay for, so to speak. And when you can't pay these highly talented people, they will go somewhere else. And when we cut education so badly in 2012 all the way to 2020, those folks heard the message and they said, you know what, we can go somewhere else and make a lot more money because we need health insurance, we need to pay our mortgage, we need to pay our kids' daycare bill and our groceries. And they needed to do that. It's not because they didn't want to. We got some of the most dedicated people in America in our schools. They have to be because they do it for next to nothing. But they can't continue to do that and pay their bills. And we, as a state, need to make good on getting talented people, qualified people in our classrooms versus others.
Well, I've got to say personally, as somebody who's both a certified teacher and spent many years as a journalist, I'm honest, my husband has subsidized my career. I could not have afforded it otherwise. I know another thing that I hear a lot of from teachers, and I'm sure you do too, Suzanne, is the respect issue. It's just not there in the public anymore.
Right, yes, and yeah, I mean, they're ostracized. I mean, the schools are taking the blame for all kinds of societal issues. I mean, they take the kids that, they take them as they get them, and, even if they show growth, if that child is still well below grade level, that's what's harped on. The test scores are below grade level, or on the first level of the state assessments. So yeah, I mean, they're getting it from all sides. And during COVID, they were the heroes. Remember? I mean, they were oh, thank goodness for our teachers, sticking in there. But it's changed a little bit since then.
Well, special ed has been one of the biggest issues we've seen over the last few years, trying to find those special ed teachers. And despite requests from across the state for Kansas to fully fund special education, the head of a special committee to look into the funding issues says they won't be meeting. We've been telling you for about a year now how Kansas education leaders have urged state lawmakers to increase funding for special education. The legislature doesn't meet the funding level called for in state law, 92% of special education costs that are not covered by the federal government. So local school districts have had to pay the difference, they say, taking the money from general education classrooms. But some lawmakers said the funding formula itself is the problem, not the amount of money. Representative Christy Williams, who chairs the Select Committee on Education and the Special Education Task Force, said districts get money from local taxpayers that isn't counted as part of their special ed funding, as well as funds collected for virtual students. She said districts have enough money in reserves to fund special education services. Quote, ultimately, the money is there. Last session, lawmakers rejected Democratic Governor Laura Kelly's plan for an additional $72 million in special ed funding. They approved about $7.5 million instead. The legislature also passed a law establishing that task force to study special education. But the Kansas Association of School Boards reports Williams says the issues are broader than just fully funding the current special education formula. She said the special education statutes need a complete overhaul, quote, especially the funding. I'll tell you what, there is no way that a funding task force could begin to crack that code. She recommended an overhaul of the special education funding system by 2027. So another idea, a big overhaul. But my question coming out of all of that is, why not fully fund until you've completed that overhaul?
I think part of the problem that they have is that they realize just throwing money at the problem isn't it. There's a lot of questions about process and how teaching, for example, when they talk about the reading scores and how they want to teach evidence-based reading practices rather than whole language before, as an example. The reality is that of all the things we did, and this is like old home week for me, because when I served in the Senate, we were talking about these very issues the entire time, special session, all that stuff, 2005. But this is the most complicated, hard to relate to topic of what all the legislators do. And, you know, I can remember there was one guy that was like the magician on the formula, and he's gone. And, you know, there's a lot of unintended consequences that happen. For example, a change in the state law from last year kept school districts from selling property they weren't using. They have all these unintended consequences, and you throw that pebble in the pond, and the ripples go out in this funding formula, and unintended things can happen that can be quite devastating.
But my question is, wasn't that the reason for setting up the task force? Is like, let's get people from all these different areas. Let's get teachers and special education teachers and experts in the formula and, you know, administrators and all those people together in a room to really dig into the formula. And that's what I don't understand with some of the stuff that was said over the past 2 weeks. It's like, oh, they'd never begin to crack the code. That was sort of the reason for bringing them together. And now what's the alternative, I guess? Is it more, you know, just he said, she said testimony to the education committee? I mean, that's the only, at some point you are going to have to get people together to say, you know, this is how it works. And yes, it's incredibly complicated. At-risk weightings and the, you know, LOB versus general fund and all of that stuff. No one really understands it. And to, you know, but I thought the whole purpose of the Special Education Task Force was to really study it and to get into it and to see what could be corrected.
The issue I saw from that report was they asked for $70 million and gave them $7 million. So 10%. I don't know a budget request out there that can live on 10% of the request. And these are some of our most needy students that need that funding. The teachers need the funding. The school districts need the funding. And we know that those students need additional help, and we give them 10% of what, pursuant to this study, is requesting.
I have to tell you, I think there's a lot of Republicans in the legislature that aren't going to agree with you on that one, because they want them to justify that funding. They want them to tell them what they're going to spend it on. Just because even the post audit said, look, if you just throw money at a problem, it doesn't work unless you throw money at a problem in a useful way. I mean, you know, only politicians have to have a study to tell them that.
But I guess my question is, what made the legislature the PhD on education? And that's the problem I have, is they don't listen to the people who are actually telling them what they need. And they insert their own opinion for what the experts say.
You got kids, right? They listen to you.
I'm not saying these are kids.
You know, they have an answer they want to find, and that's what they listen for. It's a confirmation bias kind of thing that goes on, and it's one thing about governing that is probably the most difficult, is to try to look at a problem objectively and go, are we right? Are we on the right path? And try to listen to others and get those perspectives and not discount them because they're counter to what you believe.
But they can't just throw 10% of the budget at it and then say, if we throw one more dollar at that, we're just throwing money at the problem. They're throwing no money at the problem. That's not going to solve it.
I think if you look at the funding that they have gone through since Gannon and since Montoy and all these cases that, well, that's what we're going to talk about later, is they say we met our burden. You know, we met our burden, and let's just put it to bed.
But the number of special education students keeps growing, and their needs get more and more expensive and just and severe, and those costs go up.
I think it's that we're better at diagnosing them than we were 10 years ago, and we're finding more of them. It's not that it's a bigger problem. It's that we're better at identifying it and then applying resources to it. It's not a bigger problem in the sense of the number of kids who need the services. Right. It's a bigger problem in the sense that we now have a better handle on the number of kids that need the services. I agree with you there. Yeah.
All right, so what does all this tell us about what we can expect from lawmakers this next session? Good question. In addition to hinting at plans to change the formula for funding special education, a KMUW report takes a look at why some expect conservative lawmakers to continue pushing more school choice measures this next year. A KSDE report released this week shows student test scores have started to rebound after dropping during the pandemic. Every grade level improved on the math assessment, and 6 of 7 scored higher overall in English language arts. But lawmakers said Kansas students continue to underperform, with nearly half of 8th graders and a third of 5th graders scoring at the lowest level on state math tests. The chair of the Select Committee on Education, Representative Christy Williams, said as more money is going into the system specifically for the students that need it most, something is not working and the outcomes are declining. Meanwhile, Williams invited several school choice advocates to speak to the committee, including representatives of the Kansas Policy Institute and Patrick Wolf, a University of Arkansas professor who studies school choice and supports vouchers. Opponents of voucher measures, including public school superintendents, teachers unions, and the Kansas State Board of Education, say vouchers undermine public schools with no measurable improvements. And I know a lot of educators that I've spoken with over the last couple of weeks, reading the headlines from these committee hearings, they are bracing themselves for what they consider another legislative session of attacks similar to ones we've seen, 10 years ago.
The test score issue is just par for the course for that. It was so interesting to me. It was on the same day the State Board of Education was getting the new results in, and honestly celebrating with good reason a rebound for the first time since COVID, and it's going to be incremental, and that's what I think the general population and certainly lawmakers need to realize, that any growth is to be celebrated. And to their credit, I mean, the conservative Republicans on the committee did say that's great news. Of course we celebrate that. But they are very, very insistent that this test score is the judge of how schools are doing, because and it is, what they take every year, and it's an easy way to look at what these particular grades are doing year to year. But yeah, it's going to be another session of looking at those scores, talking about underachieving, and then saying parents should have a way out of failing public schools.
And I find that interesting because I don't know if you ever saw, I think it was called Summer School. It was this movie back in the late 80s where this guy, he's a substitute teacher, he's brought in to teach summer school. And it's all these kids that are failing, and his job is to try and get them to pass the test. Well, throughout the process, he gets about half of them to pass the test. But the others, well, they don't pass, their improvement was incredible, was huge. And that just kind of speaks to this situation, and really what it makes me think of is there are so many other skills that these tests don't show. They don't measure the ability to show up every day. They don't measure the ability to come into work on time, to be respectful, to get along with your peers. All those things that employers are saying they're having trouble finding these days.
There was a really interesting exchange between David Smith of the Shawnee Mission School District and Representative Christy Williams just about test scores, and David Smith was making that point. Like, we look at a lot of things. The test score, that test is one measure.
On one day,
and they came back with, are you saying, but this test is developed by teachers. Are you saying it's not useful? And it was a very interesting back and forth.
To that point, our public schools are basically one of the last places where America exists. You don't have any discrimination on class, race, or gender. And you don't have that very many other places in this country anymore. Or ability, right. Thank you. You can show up and you're with everybody, regardless of ability, race, class, or gender. And that's a great thing for our country. We don't know how to get along anymore. But yet at a school, you're put there, you go, you show up, and you get along with everybody that's not necessarily like you. And we need more of that. And that's why these schools are so important.
These tests are like statistics. These tests are like statistics. They can be illuminating, like a lamppost, or you can lean on them like a drunk. And so the misuse of the test scores can offer opportunities to people to try to get other things accomplished. And so it's important to try to keep all of these things in perspective. And I think the reality is that it's far more complicated than these simplistic arguments. They say it's the schools, no, it's the parents. It's it's all of it. It's all of these inputs that come into something that is almost impossible to actually objectively measure.
Well,
other than with this little test.
Schools are not businesses building widgets.
Right.
They're buildings, hopefully,
Human beings.
growing human
Right.
beings.
Yes.
Right. And
They
the
can actually
Shawnee
think for
Mission.
themselves.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, the Shawnee Mission representative said, I can tell you that I've never had one student come up to me and say, I was applying for a job, but, they wanted my scores on the state assessment test, and, I just didn't make it. That's
Same
just
thing
not
true
happening.
about bar exams.
There you go.
Okay.
For that matter, same thing's true about passing the teacher
That's true.
exam.
Right.
Yeah.
Once you
Yep.
pass, you pass.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think school choice is going to be the huge fight.
Oh, for sure.
With
Yeah.
vouchers. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I can hear that one coming.
Oh, yeah. Well, much of this wrangling comes down to whether additional money pumped into public schools under the school funding lawsuit is bringing the state's kids the promised better education. Now, the state attorney general is asking the state Supreme Court to make it harder for local school districts to force higher spending in the future. The Associated Press reports Attorney General Chris Kobach's office wants the Kansas Supreme Court to close a lawsuit four school districts filed against the state back in 2010. The state Supreme Court issued 7 rulings from 2013 through 2019 because of that lawsuit, requiring the legislature to increase funding for public schools and to make its formula for distributing its funds fairer to poor areas of the state. The justices said in 2019 the legislature has complied with their directives, but they kept the case open to ensure lawmakers fulfill their promises. This is because Kansas has been in and out of school funding lawsuits for several decades, with lawmakers promising increases in spending and then backing off when the economy sours and state revenues become tight. With the lawsuit still open and in the state Supreme Court's hands, school districts can go directly to the justices each year if they don't believe lawmakers have provided enough money. If the case were closed, districts would have to file a new lawsuit in district court that likely would take several years to reach the state Supreme Court. And this is kind of where a lot of us were talking about before the show. It feels like we've been here before. You and I, Suzanne, have been covering this for years. You were in the State House when Montoy first started, right. And you were there with the last round. What's new?
Nada. There's nothing new under the sun.
Well, it's new that they want to close this case. It was so interesting to me because every time we got a Gannon decision, and I say there were several, as you remember, it was like, is this the end? Is this the end? No, we're keeping it open because we need a check on the lawmakers. They've proven in the past that, that when money is tight, as you said, in 2008, huge cuts across the state, lots of teacher layoffs and just really, really draconian cuts because the legislature didn't fulfill its end of the bargain. So the court is there to hold check on that.
Yeah, when I have a client that has won a judgment against a defendant, the case does stay open so you can enforce the judgment, and that's the way I see this situation. I'm not privy to all of the motions and briefs, etc., but it just seems like it would be, if you have a client or a person or an entity that is chronically not paying the judgment, a judge is reluctant to close a case. That's just my opinion.
Well, from what I see in the news story, and I mean, I'm not privy to any of this on the inside, it appears that our former district court judge, our former state representative, our former Court of Appeals judge, Tony Powell, who's now the Solicitor General for the Attorney General, is going to argue to them that they've satisfied it and they would like to have it closed off. Like Judge, I've got through my probation. Can we terminate it right now? And we'll just see. I think it's the Supreme Court's call, whatever 4 of them say. I can't divine what they're going to do with it, but even going through these articles, I saw contradictions between what one would say as opposed to the other, like, oh, we've always complied, and then the other one says, no, you haven't. And so, I'm sure it'll come down to some hearing and an argument.
The schools are just now getting up to full funding. I mean, just now. Right. And I know that there's a lot of administrators out there just kind of holding their collective breath thinking, please don't close this lawsuit.
And this is a 10-year long lawsuit. Why?
One of many.
Why would you want Why would you want to have to start over on something like this when you know what the facts are? You've had the trial, you've had the appeals, you've had 7 different rulings. Why would you want to close it and start all the way over again when you know it's already happened?
You know what's different about it this time? Is we didn't have any money when I was in the legislature, and now they do.
There actually is one other difference. We've had a change in several of the justices on the Supreme Court bench, but at the same time, the core of those who voted in favor of these judgments still seems to be there.
Right. So it is interesting if it gets if they decide on this. I mean, my inclination would be that they would hold it open, but you know, anything can happen, especially with school funding decisions. It's been just crazy over the years. But
you know, don't hold your breath. It'll be the last thing they do in the session.
Right.
They'll do it at 2 o'clock in the morning. They always do. What did it, Judge Eric Yost, when he was in the Senate, he used to call it, "It's time to feed the beast."
And that's public schools.
Yeah, and that was public schools.
Yeah, I mean, but yeah, I mean, it's almost like at the honor system now. You're fully funded. See, we can do it. You know, get off our backs or something. But I mean, there still needs to be a check there.
I don't know why the legislature doesn't want to fund schools. That's my problem. It's like, why do we want people on welfare?
I think
that's what happens when we don't fund schools and give people a shot at an education.
I don't think that's
they
the
end
question
up on
they're
welfare.
answering.
Well,
I don't think there's anybody getting elected saying, "I don't want to fund schools. Send me to Topeka so I can do that." I don't see
there
that.
is a core of the population that does believe that's the case, though.
Well,
that there is a distinct effort to completely kill the public school system in the United States, which, by the way, only came into being after after the Civil War. I just jumped a century there.
Well, you know, I mean, I don't see them making any headway. But
vouchers and homeschooling, there seems to be a push on all those things.
If you divert the tax money, the more you divert tax money to private schools, that's the
right.
That's the
right.
That goes back to school choice and what they're going to do with vouchers and see what happens there. That's the issue to watch next.
Well, it's
session.
going to be a huge push again. It has to. I mean, it's just
big push.
in the water.
All right. Well, we're, 2 months away? We'll have to wait and see what happens. Thanks again for joining us, Suzanne and Phil and Tim. We really appreciate you being here. We'd also like to thank our news partners at KSN News, Cake News, and the Wichita Eagle for sharing their materials with us. We'd love to hear your thoughts or ideas for future shows. Just email us at kansasweek@kpts.org. For now, stay safe and have a great week.